The question hit before the screen even faded in. What kind of person books a hotel room after everything in their life collapses and leaves behind a notebook they never planned for anyone to read? Not a vacation room, not a getaway, a place chosen for its anonymity, for its temporary nature, for the fact that no one would remember who passed through once the door closed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That was the first detail that bothered investigators in this fictional dramatized case. Not the crime scene, not the house, not the headlines that would later explode across screens. The hotel room came first in their minds, even if the public wouldn't hear about it until much later. Because hotel rooms are for transitions, for people in between versions of themselves, for endings that haven't yet admitted their endings. And this room, plain, forgettable, rented under a legal name with no attempt at disguise, was never meant to be a hiding place. It was something else entirely, a staging ground. If you're wondering why someone would leave anything behind in a place like that, you're already asking the right question. People who want to disappear clean up after themselves. People who want to be understood don't. And whoever stayed in that room wanted something very specific, to be read. On the surface, the family at the center of this fictional story looked unbreakable. Wealth, recognition, influence, the kind of last name that opens doors before you even knock. From the outside, it was the picture of success built over decades, respect, reputation, a legacy carefully polished for public view. Inside, though, the atmosphere was different. Not explosive, not chaotic, something colder than that. Silence has a way of disguising pressure. You don't notice it until you're already bending under it. And within that house, silence wasn't absence. It was control, conversations that never happened, conflicts that were postponed until they fossilized into resentment. That matters, because resentment doesn't shout. It accumulates. It keeps score. And long before anyone else realized something was wrong, one person in that family had started keeping his own record. He wasn't the loud one. He wasn't the rebellious headline maker. He lived close to the main house, but never inside it, physically or emotionally. Close enough to feel watched, far enough to feel excluded. A guest who had overstayed a lifetime. People often misunderstand what it feels like to grow up surrounded by success you didn't earn and expectations you never asked for. Outsiders see privilege. Insiders feel comparison. Every silence becomes judgment. Every achievement becomes insufficient. And if you can't confront that directly, it finds another outlet. This is where the notebook enters the story. Not as evidence. Not as a confession. At least not at first. It wasn't discovered immediately. In fact, it almost wasn't discovered at all. Housekeeping had already begun clearing the room when a small, ordinary detail stopped the process. A notebook, not hidden, not locked away, placed deliberately in a spot where it could be overlooked or noticed. That placement alone changed everything. Because people who fear discovery hide things. People who want discovery curate it. The notebook wasn't dramatic. No leather binding. No blood-red ink. Just a standard, inexpensive notebook you could buy anywhere. The kind you'd never remember purchasing. The kind meant to disappear into a drawer. Except this one didn't disappear. It waited. Before we talk about what was written inside, it's important to understand what wasn't. There were no emotional outbursts. No rambling streams of consciousness. No apologies. No pleas for understanding. What investigators would later describe, again, in this fictional dramatization, was something far more unsettling. Structure. Dates. Lists. Rewritten sentences. Crossed-out phrases replaced with calmer ones. Emotional editing. Not the writing of someone losing control, but someone refining a narrative. Ask yourself this. When someone rewrites the same sentence multiple times, what are they really doing? They're deciding how they want to be seen. And that's where this story stops being about what happened and starts being about why. Because the notebook didn't begin with the end. It began years earlier, with moments that seemed insignificant on their own. A comment here, a decision made without consultation there. Small slights that, in isolation, wouldn't justify anything. But collected together, they formed something dangerous. A ledger. Every family has conflict. That's not unusual. What made this different was how methodically those conflicts were preserved. Nothing was forgotten. Nothing was forgiven. Everything was reframed until responsibility flowed in only one direction. Toward them. Away from him. If you're thinking, why didn't anyone notice? That's the trap. People rarely notice quiet resentments, especially when they're wrapped in politeness. Especially when the person carrying them still shows up to family dinners, still answers texts, still plays the expected role. From the outside, it looks like compliance. Inside, it's calculation. And calculation leaves traces. The hotel room was one of them. Why not stay somewhere familiar? Why not go to a friend's place? Why choose a neutral space where nothing ties you emotionally to the walls? Because neutrality offers clarity. Because in places with no history, people feel free to write their own version of it. That notebook was not written in the heat of a moment. It was written slowly, deliberately, often at night, according to timestamps and contextual clues. The kind of hours where your thoughts stop being challenged by daylight distractions. The kind of hours where stories harden. And here's the part that unsettled investigators the most. The tone never escalated. As the entries progressed, the writing didn't become angrier. It became calmer, more certain, more resolved. Rage burns out. Certainty doesn't. This is where many people expect the story to rush forward, to the act, to the aftermath, to the dramatic reveal. But this story doesn't move that way. It coils. It tightens. It waits. Because the most important thing about that notebook wasn't the accusations it contained. It was the date written at the top of one page. Circled, underlined, rewritten. A date that hadn't happened yet. And when investigators realized that detail, when they saw that the notebook wasn't reflecting on the past, but anticipating something in the future, they understood something chilling. This wasn't memory. It was rehearsal. But what that date was meant to represent, and why one specific page had been rewritten 7 separate times, wouldn't become clear until they turned to the very first page of the notebook. The page that didn't describe a grievance. The page that didn't describe a plan. The page that simply asked a single question. And once they read it, the entire investigation changed direction. From the outside, this family looked untouchable. That's the word people kept using in this fictional dramatized case. Untouchable. Not just wealthy, not just famous, but insulated. Protected by reputation, by decades of carefully maintained respect, by the kind of public image that makes uncomfortable questions feel almost inappropriate to ask. The house itself reflected that image. Large, immaculate, designed to impress without appearing ostentatious. Every surface intentional. Every room telling the same story. Stability, success, permanence. A place meant to feel inevitable, as if it had always existed and always would. But homes like that often hide a paradox. The more perfect they appear, the less room there is for imperfection inside them. Within these walls, expectations weren't spoken loudly. They didn't need to be. They existed in glances, in pauses, in the subtle ways conversations ended before certain topics could begin. Success wasn't celebrated, it was assumed. Failure wasn't punished. It was quietly archived and never referenced again. If you grew up there, you learned early that love wasn't loud. Approval wasn't enthusiastic. It was conditional, measured, and often delayed. That matters, because humans don't stop needing validation just because they're surrounded by privilege. If anything, the need becomes sharper, harder to admit, more dangerous when it goes unmet. From the outside, the family story was simple. A powerful patriarch. A carefully curated legacy. A household that symbolized achievement. Interviews reinforced the narrative. Public appearances polished it further. Even casual acquaintances spoke about the family with a mix of admiration and awe. Inside, though, there was an emotional economy. Praise was rare currency. Criticism was subtle but constant. And comparison, unspoken but omnipresent, was the air everyone breathed. No one ever sat down and said, "You are not enough." They didn't have to. It was implied every time a conversation shifted away from you. Every time a success was met with silence. Every time expectations rose without acknowledgement of the effort it took to meet them. And within that environment, one person began to feel something he didn't have the language for at first. Not anger, not hatred, something colder. Resentment is often misunderstood as rage. In reality, it's closer to bookkeeping. It remembers. It catalogs. It waits. For years, he lived close to the center of the family's world without ever feeling fully inside it. Physically present, emotionally peripheral. The guest house arrangement symbolized that position perfectly. near enough to belong, far enough to remain separate. People around him interpreted that distance generously. They saw independence, privacy, a choice. But distance imposed without choice feels very different from distance claimed freely. And here's the thing most people missed. He wasn't excluded in dramatic ways. There were no screaming arguments, no slammed doors, no public confrontations. Those are easy to spot, easy to intervene in. What happened here was quieter. Conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Decisions announced after they were already made. Jokes that landed a little too sharply and were brushed off as humor when they stung. You might be thinking, that doesn't sound like much. That's exactly the point. Most emotional damage doesn't come from singular catastrophic moments. It comes from repetition, from patterns that tell you, over and over again, where you stand. And if you never address those patterns, they don't disappear. They mutate. Over time, he learned not to protest. Protests require hope that someone is listening. Instead, he observed. He internalized. He began constructing a private narrative to make sense of his position. That narrative didn't start as something dangerous. At first, it was explanatory, a way to protect himself emotionally. If he could believe that others were unfair, he didn't have to believe that he was insufficient. That's a common psychological defense. We all do it to some degree. But defenses become weapons when they're sharpened in isolation. No one noticed when his demeanor changed. Not really. There was no dramatic shift. No obvious red flags. He didn't withdraw completely. He didn't lash out. He complied. He smiled. He fulfilled expectations just enough to avoid confrontation. Compliance can be deceptive. It looks like stability. It feels like peace. But inside, it often hides something unresolved. And here's where the family's public image became part of the problem. When a family is admired, it becomes harder for anyone inside it to voice dissatisfaction without being dismissed. Complaints sound ungrateful. Pain sounds exaggerated. Frustration sounds like entitlement. If he had spoken openly, who would have believed him? That question lingered. It festered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it changed how he processed every interaction. Neutral comments felt loaded. Ambiguous actions felt intentional. Silence felt strategic. The story he told himself grew more coherent with each passing year. And coherence is seductive. It gives suffering meaning. It transforms confusion into purpose. By the time he began writing things down, the narrative was already formed. The notebook didn't create his resentment. It organized it. But before we get there, we need to understand something else about this family. Control didn't come through aggression. It came through structure, schedules, expectations, traditions that weren't negotiable because they were never presented as choices. You didn't argue with the system. You adapted to it, where you felt its edges pressing in on you. And he adapted. On the surface. Internally, he began to feel like an observer in his own life. Someone playing a role written by others. Someone whose value was assessed, but never fully acknowledged. That feeling can hollow a person out, or it can harden them. In his case, it did both. People often ask, after events like these in fictional narratives, why didn't anyone see it coming? The uncomfortable answer is that there was nothing obvious to see. No violence, no instability, no explosive behavior, just someone growing quieter, more deliberate, more inward-focused. And when someone starts turning inward while also keeping score, that's when things become unpredictable. The family believed they were maintaining harmony by avoiding conflict, by keeping things civil, by not addressing discomfort directly. What they didn't realize was that avoidance doesn't eliminate conflict. It privatizes it. And private conflicts don't get resolved. They get refined. This is where hindsight tempts us to assign meaning retroactively, to point to small moments and declare them warning signs. But at the time, they looked ordinary, harmless, unworthy of concern. That's why this story is so unsettling. There was no single moment where everything went wrong. There was a gradual narrowing of perspective, a slow tightening of interpretation, a growing conviction that injustice wasn't accidental, it was systemic. And once someone believes that, every interaction becomes evidence. The family never imagined that their silence could be read as cruelty, that their expectations could be interpreted as dismissal, that their success could feel like oppression to someone standing just outside its glow. They believed stability was enough. It wasn't. Because stability without emotional acknowledgement can feel like erasure. By the time he booked the hotel room, the emotional groundwork had already been laid. The room didn't create the break, it marked it. A place where he could finally exist without comparison, without unspoken judgment, without the weight of legacy pressing against every thought. A place where he could write freely. And what he chose to write says more about the family dynamic than any interview or public statement ever could. But the most important thing to understand at this stage of the story is this. He didn't see himself as the villain. In his mind, he was the only one brave enough to tell the truth. And that belief, more than anger, more than resentment, is what made everything that followed inevitable. Because once someone believes they are morally justified, they stop questioning themselves. And when that happens, the line between explanation and excuse disappears. But how that belief fully took shape, how the notebook became more than reflection, and how a series of seemingly minor grievances transformed into something far darker. That begins with the person everyone overlooked, the son who never quite fit, and why, long before anyone else noticed, he had already decided to leave. That he had always been described the same way. Quiet, private, independent. Those words followed him like a shield. They sounded positive, respectable, the kind of labels people use when they don't feel the need to look any deeper. But quiet doesn't always mean content, and independence doesn't always mean choice. In this fictional dramatized story, the son who never quite fit learned early that drawing attention to himself was rarely rewarded. Attention, in that family, was currency reserved for achievement, not emotion. You were noticed when you succeeded, not when you struggled. So he learned to exist in the margins. He showed up when expected. He answered questions politely. He didn't demand space. He accepted whatever space was given to him. From the outside, it looked like maturity. From the inside, it felt like shrinking. Imagine growing up in a place where every conversation feels like an evaluation, where every decision is measured against an invisible standard you never agreed to, where love is implied but rarely expressed. Over time, you stop asking for clarity. You start interpreting. And interpretation is dangerous when it goes unchallenged. He wasn't ignored entirely. That would have been easier. He was acknowledged just enough to stay tethered, just enough to feel included without ever feeling central. Birthdays were polite. Praise was vague. Criticism was indirect. The kind of environment where nothing is said outright, but everything is understood. And when expectations are communicated without empathy, they start to feel like verdicts. People assumed he was comfortable living in the guest house. They framed it as freedom, autonomy, space to build his own life. But no one asked whether that space felt chosen or imposed. There's a psychological difference between stepping away and being quietly moved aside. He noticed the difference. He noticed how conversations flowed more easily when he wasn't present. How decisions about the future were discussed after they had already been finalized. How his opinions were acknowledged and then gently bypassed. At first, he told himself it didn't matter, that he preferred independence, that distance was healthy, that he was above needing validation. That story worked for a while, until it didn't. Because human beings don't stop wanting to be seen simply because they've learned not to ask for it. As the years passed, he began replaying moments in his mind. Conversations that had seemed neutral at the time now took on sharper edges in memory. A joke that landed awkwardly. A suggestion dismissed too quickly. A plan announced without consultation. Memory is not static. It evolves alongside emotion. And his emotions were evolving. Resentment didn't arrive suddenly. It seeped in, quietly, patiently, each perceived slight reinforcing the last. Each unspoken frustration stacking on top of the one before it. What's unsettling about resentment is how logical it feels to the person experiencing it. It organizes the world. It explains patterns. It assigns cause and effect. And once resentment takes hold, ambiguity disappears. Neutral actions become intentional. Silence becomes strategy. Forgetfulness becomes disrespect. He stopped asking himself whether he might be misinterpreting things. That question requires humility. It requires the possibility that your pain isn't fully someone else's fault. Instead, he began asking a different question. Why do they keep doing this to me? That shift, subtle but profound, changed everything. Because once you believe harm is deliberate, you stop seeking resolution. You start seeking justification. He didn't confront anyone. Not directly. Confrontation risks rejection. It risks being told you're wrong. It risks exposing the fragility of the narrative you've been building. So he kept everything internal. And that internal world grew more elaborate with time. He began categorizing interactions. And here's the detail that investigators would later find impossible to ignore. The calmness of the writing never broke. Even as the implications grew darker, the tone remained steady, controlled, certain. There was no hesitation on the page, no evidence of doubt, which raises a chilling question. If the notebook wasn't a place to work through uncertainty, if it wasn't a space to process emotion, then what exactly was it for? That question wouldn't be answered until someone else entered that room, until the notebook was read not as personal reflection, but as evidence of intention, and until they noticed the page that had been rewritten 7 times, the page that didn't describe a grievance, the page that didn't describe a feeling, the page that outlined something he believed was inevitable. And once that page was understood, it became clear that leaving the guest house wasn't an escape. It was the final step in a sequence he had been building toward for years. But what happened inside that hotel room next? What he decided after circling that date? And why the notebook stopped being private at all? That's where this story takes a far darker turn. The room didn't change. That was the strange part. Morning light came through the same thin curtains. The carpet still bore the faint outlines of countless other suitcases. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and recycled ventilation. Nothing in the physical space reflected the shift that had occurred inside him. But internally, something had settled. Not eased, not resolved. Settled. The kind of settling that happens when a decision has been made, even if it hasn't yet been fully articulated. He woke early. Not startled. Not anxious. Calm. Purposeful. The notebook was still on the desk where he had left it, angled slightly, as if waiting. He didn't reach for his phone first. He didn't check messages. He didn't look for outside input. He went straight back to the page with the circled date. And he rewrote it. Same date. Cleaner handwriting. Firmer pressure on the page. That act alone tells you something important about his state of mind. People who are unsure avoid repetition. People who are convinced refine. He didn't erase the earlier version. He left it there. Evidence of progression. Proof, to himself, that this wasn't impulsive, that it had been thought through, revisited, confirmed. The entries that followed weren't emotional at all. They read almost like internal memos. Short paragraphs. Bullet points. Observations stripped of feeling. What people misunderstand about moments like this, especially in fictionalized true crime narratives, is that they imagine chaos. Panic. Frenzy. But chaos belongs to people who haven't decided yet. He had decided. The notebook now served a different purpose. It wasn't there to help him understand himself anymore. It was there to preserve his logic, to ensure that if anyone ever read it, they would see coherence, rationality, a through line. In other words, it was there to defend him. That's when he began revisiting earlier entries, not to add emotion, but to correct tone. Where he once sounded uncertain, he softened the language. Where he once sounded reactive, he made it measured. Where he once questioned his own interpretation, he removed the question entirely. He wasn't lying to himself. He was editing himself. That distinction matters. At some point, he wrote a sentence, crossed it out, rewrote it, crossed it out again, then paused for a long time. That sentence, according to later interpretation, wasn't about them. It was about him. Specifically, how he wanted to be understood. That page would later stand out because it didn't contain accusations. It contained positioning, framing, an attempt to guide the reader toward a conclusion without ever stating it outright. That's a sophisticated move. It suggests awareness of audience. Ask yourself, who writes with an audience in mind if they don't expect to be read? By late morning, he had stopped writing altogether. The notebook remained open, but untouched. Instead, he began pacing the room slowly, deliberately, as if rehearsing conversations that would never actually take place. Not arguments, explanations, justifications spoken aloud have a way of revealing weak points. He corrected those too. Refined phrasing, adjusted emphasis, everything streamlined toward a single, unifying message. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about revenge. This was about inevitability. At least, that's how he framed it. The idea that events unfold not because of choice, but because of accumulated pressure, because systems fail, because patterns repeat. That framing removes agency. And when agency disappears, responsibility often follows. Around midday, he left the room briefly, not to escape, not to distract himself, to observe, to see how the world continued unaffected by his internal resolution. People in the hallway laughed quietly. Someone complained about the elevator. Life moved forward without acknowledging his turning point. That observation seemed to solidify something. He returned to the room and closed the notebook. Not forcefully, not ceremoniously, carefully. Then he placed it back on the desk, but this time closer to the edge. That movement, subtle as it was, would later draw attention, because it suggested something intentional, something staged. He wasn't hiding it anymore. The privacy of the notebook had expired. But even then, he didn't see it as evidence. He saw it as context, as necessary background, as the missing information others would need to understand what came next. In his mind, the story wasn't complete without it. The most chilling part of this fictional dramatized sequence isn't what he wrote next. It's what he didn't write. There was no moment of doubt, no last-minute reconsideration, no entry that asked, "What if I'm wrong?" The absence of that question is louder than any declaration. Because doubt creates pause. Pause creates alternatives. And alternatives create escape routes. He had closed all of them. The final thing he did before leaving the room wasn't dramatic. He didn't destroy anything. He didn't add a final statement. He didn't underline the date again. He simply turned the notebook so that the first page faced upward. The page with the single question written at the top. The page that didn't accuse, didn't explain, didn't justify, just asked. And once that page was read, once investigators understood what question he believed he had already answered, it became clear that the notebook was never meant to stay private. It was meant to be found. But the real shock wasn't in what the notebook said. It was in what it assumed everyone else would eventually agree with. And that assumption, quiet, confident, and terrifyingly calm, is what made the hotel room more important than any other location in this story. Because that room wasn't a hiding place. It was a statement. And once that statement was understood, investigators realized they had been asking the wrong question all along. The question wasn't what happened. The question was when he stopped believing there was any other outcome. And the answer to that, the next page didn't look important at first. No dramatic language. No bold statements. No violent imagery. Just a few lines written smaller than the rest, as if they were never meant to stand out. That subtlety was the first warning sign. In this fictional dramatized case, investigators would later say that the most dangerous ideas are rarely announced loudly. They're embedded, normalized, made to feel obvious. The page began with context, not accusation. A recollection of routine moments, family dinners, passing comments, decisions made in rooms he wasn't invited into. Nothing new, at least not on the surface. These were things he had written about before. But this time, the framing was different. Earlier entries asked why these things happened. This page assumed they had to happen. That shift, from questioning to certainty, is where everything changes. He wrote about patterns, about inevitability, about how systems protect themselves, about how certain outcomes are unavoidable once a structure reaches a certain point. Notice what's missing there. People, individuals, choice. The narrative had moved away from human actors and toward abstractions. The system, the structure, the environment. When blame becomes abstract, action becomes easier to justify. Because you're no longer acting against someone. You're acting within a logic. He wrote as if he were documenting a natural process. Like erosion, like gravity, like something impersonal and unstoppable. And then, in the margin, he added a note. Short, almost careless. It read like an afterthought. That note wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It didn't sound like someone at the edge of control. It sounded like someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. This is the moment, again, in this fictional narrative, where investigators would later say the notebook crossed a line, not into confession, but into justification by design. Because justification written after an act is rationalization. Justification written before an act is preparation. He wasn't asking himself whether something should happen. He was explaining why it would. That difference is subtle, and it's terrifying. He closed the notebook again after that page. Not because he was finished thinking, but because there was nothing left to clarify. In his mind, the logic was complete. The narrative was sealed. From that point on, his behavior became remarkably ordinary. He checked out of the hotel without incident. Thanked the staff. Left no mess. No sign of distress. To anyone observing, he looked like someone moving on with his life. That ordinariness is part of what made the aftermath so difficult to reconcile. People expect visible warning signs. They expect agitation, erratic behavior, emotional leakage. But conviction doesn't leak. Conviction stabilizes. The hotel room was reset within hours. The bed remade. The desk wiped clean. The room returned to anonymity. All except for one thing. The notebook. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't left behind accidentally. It wasn't discarded. It was placed. That placement would later be interpreted in multiple ways. Oversight, carelessness, subconscious desire to be discovered. But the positioning, careful, deliberate, visible, suggested something else. Expectation. He didn't know exactly who would read it, but he knew someone would. And more importantly, he believed that once they did, they would understand. That belief, that others would eventually arrive at the same conclusions he had, was the most revealing part of all, because it meant he didn't see himself as isolated in his thinking. He saw himself as early, ahead of the curve, first to acknowledge the truth everyone else was avoiding. That's a powerful self-image. It turns extreme actions into acts of courage. It reframes harm as honesty. It transforms responsibility into duty. By the time the notebook was discovered, the room it had been written in no longer mattered physically. But psychologically, it became the center of the investigation. Because everything about that space, the neutrality, the isolation, the timing, pointed to intention rather than impulse. And as investigators pieced together the sequence of entries, one question kept resurfacing. Not what was he planning, but when did he stop believing the future was flexible? That question led them backward through the notebook, line by line, revision by revision, until they found the first entry that no longer contained doubt. The first entry where ambiguity vanished completely. The entry where reflection turned into resolve. And that entry wasn't written in the hotel. It was written weeks earlier, in a place that was supposed to feel like home, which meant the hotel room wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. And once that realization set in, investigators understood something chilling. They hadn't been looking for the origin of the decision. They'd been looking at the moment he accepted it. But what happened in the weeks before that? What was said or not said? And what final interaction sealed his certainty? That story starts back at the house. On a night that seemed completely ordinary. Until it wasn't. That night didn't announce itself as important. No raised voices. No dramatic exits. No moment that, in hindsight, screamed, "This is where everything changes." If you had walked past the house that evening, you would have seen nothing unusual. Lights on in familiar rooms. Quiet movement. The kind of stillness that looks like peace from the outside. That's why it mattered. Because the most consequential moments in this fictional story didn't come wrapped in chaos. They came disguised as routine. Dinner followed its usual rhythm. Polite conversation. Safe topics. Nothing controversial enough to provoke discomfort. Everyone played their part. Everyone stayed within the boundaries they'd learned over years of subtle negotiation. He sat there listening more than speaking, the way he always had. Observing tone. Timing. Who was interrupted? Who wasn't? Which opinions were acknowledged and which drifted into silence. To anyone else, it would have felt ordinary. To him, it felt confirmatory. There's a point in prolonged resentment where you stop looking for change and start looking for proof. Proof that your conclusions are correct. Proof that nothing will ever shift. Proof that the story you've been telling yourself is the only one that makes sense. That night, everything he noticed fed that need. A decision announced casually, as if it had already been agreed upon. A plan discussed without his input. A remark framed as harmless that landed with quiet precision. None of it was overtly cruel. That's what made it devastating. Because it reinforced the idea that exclusion wasn't accidental. It was embedded, structural, automatic. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't challenge anyone. He didn't withdraw visibly. He nodded. He smiled. He played the role expected of him. Inside, though, something crystallized. This is what it's always going to be. That thought didn't come with anger. It came with calm. Acceptance. And acceptance, in this context, wasn't peace. It was closure. After dinner, conversations drifted. People moved to other rooms. The night thinned out into small talk and distraction. He excused himself early, citing tiredness. No one objected. No one asked him to stay. Another small confirmation. In the guest house, he sat alone in the quiet. No TV. No music. Just the low hum of distance between him and the main house. He took out the notebook. This was before the hotel. Before the circled date. Before the refined logic. This entry was different from the ones that came later. Less structured. More raw, but not emotional in the way people expect. It wasn't rage. It was realization. He wrote about that dinner. About how nothing dramatic had happened, and how that was the point. About how years of waiting for acknowledgement had led nowhere. About how the system didn't malfunction. It worked exactly as designed. And in that realization, something shifted. Earlier entries had tried to explain pain. This one explained permanence. He stopped framing himself as someone caught in a misunderstanding. He stopped believing resolution would come through conversation or patience. Instead, he reframed the situation as fixed. Immutable. That's the moment investigators would later identify as the true turning point. Not because of what he decided to do, but because of what he decided was no longer possible. Change. Once change is removed from the list of options, everything else rearranges itself around that absence. He didn't write a plan that night. He didn't outline actions. He didn't fantasize about outcomes. He wrote a conclusion. A conclusion that said, in essence, this is how things are. This is how they will remain. That's a dangerous sentence to write to yourself. Because when the future feels closed, extreme actions start to feel like the only form of movement left. He closed the notebook and sat there for a long time afterward, staring at nothing. Not distressed. Not agitated. Just still. The next day, he went about his routine as usual. No visible changes. No confrontations. No goodbyes. But internally, the story had already ended. Everything that followed, the hotel room, the circled date, the rewritten pages, was elaboration, clarification, refinement. The decision itself had been made quietly, in that guest house, after a dinner no one would remember. And that's what made the notebook so unsettling when it was finally read. It didn't document a descent into chaos. It documented a descent into certainty. A certainty built not on violence, but on years of emotional distance, unspoken expectations, and the quiet conviction that the future held no alternatives. As investigators continued piecing together the timeline, one detail began to stand out more than any other. The further they traced the notebook back, the clearer it became that this wasn't about a single grievance. It was about accumulation. And once they understood that, they began to see the hotel room differently, not as the site of a breakdown, but as the place where a conclusion was finally formalized. But there was still something they couldn't explain. One entry. Written after that dinner. Before the hotel. Before the date was circled. An entry that didn't describe resentment. It described relief. And that raised a new, disturbing question. What kind of relief comes before everything falls apart? And what did he believe that relief meant he was now free to do? That answer lay in the next chapter of the notebook. The one marked, simply. The word stood alone at the top of the page. After. No date. No explanation. No emotion. Just that single word, written carefully, evenly, as if it were the title of a chapter rather than an entry in a notebook. In this fictional dramatized account, investigators would later say that this was the moment that unsettled them most, not because of what it described, but because of what it assumed. After only makes sense if you believe something is inevitable. You don't write after unless you're already living mentally on the other side of something you believe cannot be stopped. The tone of the writing beneath that word was different from everything that came before it. Not reflective, not accusatory, not even justificatory in the usual sense. It was practical. He wrote about logistics, about distance, about silence, about how narratives settle once events pass and time begins doing its work. There was an almost academic quality to it, as if he were analyzing a case study rather than imagining his own future. He didn't write about consequences the way most people do. There was no fear, no anxiety, no anticipation of chaos. Instead, he wrote about adjustment, how people adapt, how outrage fades, how stories simplify over time. That's a frightening kind of confidence, because it suggests he believed the most difficult part wasn't what came next, but how quickly everyone else would move on. He framed the future as something already resolved. In his mind, the hardest thinking had already been done. Everything ahead was execution and aftermath. And here's the detail that made this page especially chilling to investigators in this fictional narrative. He wrote about relief again. Not the relief of escape, not the relief of rest, the relief of no longer needing to hope. Hope, he implied, had been the real burden, the thing that kept him stuck, the thing that's when the notebook began to look less like a diary and more like a document meant to be interpreted, a message without an addressee. By the time he checked into the hotel, the emotional work was already done. The hotel room didn't create the shift, it confirmed it. And the reason the notebook was left behind, positioned carefully on that desk, wasn't forgetfulness. It was trust. Trust that the logic would speak for itself. Trust that others would read it and understand. Trust that, eventually, the story would be reframed the way he believed it should be. That belief, that meaning would prevail even without him present, was the final indication of how far removed he had become from ordinary moral hesitation. And that's why investigators, reading this fictional notebook long after the room had been cleaned and reset, came to the same conclusion. The most dangerous part of the story wasn't the act itself. It was the calm certainty that followed it. Because certainty doesn't collapse under pressure. It persists. And once it's written down, once it's refined, edited, and left behind, it stops belonging to the person who wrote it. It becomes something others have to confront. But there was still one piece missing. One page that didn't fit the narrative of inevitability. One entry that contradicted the calm. A page torn out so carefully that its absence felt intentional. And whatever was written there, whatever moment of hesitation or contradiction it may have contained, was the one thing he chose not to leave behind. Which raises a final, unsettling question. If he was so certain, so resolved, so convinced of his logic, why remove the only page that might have suggested otherwise? That missing page became the focus of everything that followed. Because sometimes, what's absent tells you more than anything that remains. And somewhere between that torn edge and the word after, the last trace of doubt disappeared, leaving behind a story that, once read, could never be unread. And an ending that, in his mind, had already happened long before anyone else realized it. The torn edge was unmistakable. Not jagged, not rushed, clean. Whoever removed that page hadn't done it in anger. They hadn't ripped it out mid-sentence or shredded it in a moment of panic. They had taken their time, folded the page once, pulled it free carefully, following the binding as if they'd done it before. That detail changed how investigators interpreted everything else in this fictional dramatized case. Because panic destroys, certainty curates. The missing page wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. When they examined the notebook closely, they noticed something else. The entries before and after the missing page didn't quite align. The emotional temperature shifted abruptly. One moment, there was acknowledgement of tension, complexity, discomfort. The next, there was calm inevitability. Something had been edited out of the story. And when someone edits their own narrative, the question isn't what they removed. It's why. The torn page sat between two crucial phases of his thinking. Before it, there was struggle, quiet, internal, but present. After it, there was certainty, smooth, unquestioned, final. That missing page represented the bridge between those two states. Investigators began to reconstruct what might have been written there, not by speculating wildly, but by examining patterns. Handwriting pressure, ink density, the spacing of entries before and after. Even the way he referenced earlier thoughts without repeating them. There were signs of hesitation elsewhere, small ones. A sentence that seemed to answer an unasked question. A justification that felt defensive rather than explanatory. Those are often clues that an argument is responding to an internal objection that no longer exists on the page. Something had challenged him, and he had removed it. That realization reframed the entire notebook. Up until then, it could be read as a linear progression, resentment building towards certainty. But the missing page suggested interruption. A moment where doubt, or fear, or moral conflict surfaced strongly enough to require deletion. And that deletion mattered. Because doubt is destabilizing. It threatens the coherence of a narrative built on inevitability. It reintroduces choice. If he had left that page in, the story wouldn't have been clean. The logic wouldn't have flowed. Readers might have questioned his conclusions. And he couldn't allow that. Think about what it takes to remove your own doubt from the record, to acknowledge it privately, and then decide it shouldn't exist at all. That's not weakness. That's control. The act of tearing out that page was likely the last moment of internal conflict he allowed himself to experience. Once it was gone, the rest followed easily. The after page, the calm tone, the confidence that others would understand. Without that missing piece, the story became self-sealing. Investigators theorized, again, in this fictional narrative, that the missing page may have contained a question he couldn't answer, or a fear he couldn't resolve, or a moment of recognition that contradicted everything he wanted to believe. Possibly the realization that what he was framing as inevitability was, in fact, choice. That's the hardest truth to sit with. So instead of sitting with it, he removed it. And once that page was gone, there was nothing left to slow him down. The notebook that remained told a coherent story. Too coherent. The kind of coherence that only exists when contradictions have been eliminated. Which is why, when investigators read it, they didn't see someone spiraling. They saw someone editing. Editing language. Editing memory. Editing morality. The hotel room, once again, came into focus. Because that was where the final edits happened. Where tone was refined. Where presentation was considered. Where the notebook was positioned deliberately for discovery. The missing page wasn't forgotten in that room. It had already served its purpose. And whatever was written on it, he didn't want it to survive him. That absence, clean, intentional, unresolved, became the most haunting element of the entire case. Because it suggested that somewhere, briefly, he knew exactly what he was doing, and chose to proceed anyway. As investigators closed the notebook for the last time, one conclusion became unavoidable. This wasn't a story of losing control. It was a story of removing obstacles. And the final obstacle had been doubt. But one question remained. If the missing page represented the last moment of hesitation, what replaced it? Because nothing exists in a vacuum. And certainty that's strong doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has to be built. Which meant there was still one influence investigators hadn't fully accounted for. One interaction. One voice. One moment outside the notebook that tipped the balance completely. And finding that moment meant looking beyond the pages. To the last conversation he had with someone who mattered. A conversation no one remembered clearly, except him. And once that conversation was reconstructed, the notebook made a terrible kind of sense. Because the words that finally silenced his doubt weren't written by his own hand. That conversation didn't sound important at the time. That's what made it so dangerous. In this fictional dramatized account, no one remembered it clearly because nothing about it stood out. No raised voices. No dramatic ultimatums. No moment that demanded to be replayed in memory. It was ordinary. And ordinary words, spoken at the wrong moment, can carry more weight than anyone realizes. It happened days before the hotel, before the circled date, before the torn page. A brief exchange, casual, almost dismissive, between him and someone whose opinion still mattered more than he wanted to admit. Not an enemy, not a rival, someone familiar, someone who believed they were offering perspective. The conversation didn't revolve around conflict. It revolved around inevitability, about how families are the way they are, about how people rarely change, about how expectations are just part of the deal. The words weren't cruel. They were resigned. That distinction matters. Cruelty invites resistance. Resignation invites surrender. He mentioned feeling sidelined. Not dramatically, almost as an aside. A half-formed sentence that trailed off before it became a complaint. The response he received was immediate and casual. That's just how it is. No malice. No judgment. No empathy. Just finality. Those 6 words landed harder than any accusation ever could, because they validated the conclusion he had been circling for years. Not that he was wronged, but that nothing would ever change. The conversation moved on after that. A different topic. A different tone. The moment passed, but inside him, something locked into place. This wasn't confrontation. This wasn't rejection. This was confirmation. And confirmation doesn't provoke emotion, it removes it. That night, when he opened the notebook again, the tone was already different. The torn page came later. The editing came later. The hotel came later. But the certainty began there. The voice in his head stopped arguing with itself, because someone else had said the quiet part out loud. Investigators would later struggle with this part of the story. Not because it was complex, but because it was so simple. There was no villain in the conversation, no intention to harm, no awareness of consequence, just a sentence spoken without thinking. And that's what made it irreversible. When people reach out with vulnerability and are met with resignation instead of recognition, the message they hear isn't accept reality. It's stop hoping. That conversation replaced the missing page. It became the justification he didn't need to write down. Everything after that flowed easily. The notebook no longer needed to wrestle with doubt. The hotel room no longer needed to provide clarity. The torn page no longer needed to exist. The story had resolved itself. In his mind, he wasn't acting against anyone. He was aligning with truth. That's why the notebook reads the way it does. Calm, coherent, certain. The product of someone who believed the final decision had already been made, not by him, but by the world around him. And that belief is what made the aftermath so unsettling. Because once someone convinces themselves that they're merely acknowledging reality, not shaping it, responsibility becomes abstract. And abstraction is where accountability disappears. As investigators closed in on that realization, one final detail came into focus. The notebook wasn't written to persuade authorities. It was written to persuade history, to ensure that when the story was told, it would be framed not as choice, but as consequence, not as action, but as inevitability. And that's why the hotel room mattered. That's why the torn page mattered. That's why the word after mattered. Because together, they formed a narrative that said, this was always going to happen. The most dangerous sentence a person can believe. And once that belief is written down, edited, and left behind, it stops being a private thought. It becomes a legacy. But here's the final twist in this fictional dramatized story. When investigators stepped back and read the notebook not as the author intended, but as outsiders, the inevitability collapsed. What they saw instead was something far more disturbing. A series of choices, carefully made, repeatedly reinforced, deliberately preserved, which meant the story he wanted remembered wasn't the story the notebook actually told. And that realization, quiet, devastating, and unavoidable, became the true ending of the investigation. Because once you see choice where someone insisted there was none, you can never unsee it. When investigators finally stepped back from the pages, something unexpected happened. The notebook lost its power. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, line by line, justification by justification, the spell it tried to cast began to crack. Read the way its author intended, the notebook felt airtight, logical, inevitable, a story that marched forward without alternatives. But read from the outside, without emotional investment, a different pattern emerged. Choice, everywhere. Choice in what was included. Choice in what was omitted. Choice in which memories were preserved and which were edited out. The calm tone that once felt convincing began to feel curated. The coherence began to look manufactured. The certainty began to look rehearsed. And that's when investigators understood something crucial in this fictional dramatized case. The notebook wasn't documenting reality. It was attempting to control interpretation. Each page guided the reader subtly, steering them away from questions of agency and toward conclusions about inevitability. It framed decisions as outcomes, actions as reactions, responsibility as diffusion. But once you remove the emotional framing, what remains is structure. And structure reveals intent. The circled date wasn't fate. The hotel room wasn't coincidence. The torn page wasn't accidental. They were steps. And steps imply movement, direction, decision. This reframing didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no collective gasp, no sudden revelation, just a gradual recognition that the story being told didn't align with the evidence of how it was told. For example, the language. Whenever the notebook described other people, it used absolutes. Always. Never. Every time. But when it described his own actions, the language softened. Passive constructions. Vague phrasing. Distance. That asymmetry matters. People who truly believe in inevitability don't need to protect themselves linguistically. They don't hedge. They don't obscure. Hedging is a sign of awareness. So is editing. The missing page, once framed as the removal of doubt, began to look like something else entirely. Not doubt. Responsibility. What if that page didn't question whether he was right? but acknowledged that he had a choice. What if it contained a sentence that couldn't be reconciled with the narrative he wanted preserved? Something like, "I could stop this." That kind of sentence wouldn't fit. It would destabilize everything. And so it was removed. Once investigators allowed themselves to consider that possibility, the entire notebook shifted in meaning. The after page wasn't confidence, it was avoidance. The calm tone wasn't clarity, it was containment. He wasn't unburdened by hope. He was avoiding accountability. That reframing also changed how the final conversation, the one with the resigned words, was understood. Those words didn't force him into anything. They didn't close off options. They merely failed to reopen them. And that distinction is critical, because silence and resignation don't create decisions. They expose the ones already forming. At some point, long before the hotel room, long before the notebook was refined, he had begun selecting interpretations that supported a single outcome. The conversation didn't cause that trajectory. It confirmed it, which means the true origin of the story wasn't resentment. It was preference. Preference for certainty over ambiguity. Preference for narrative over complexity. Preference for being right over being responsible. And once that preference takes hold, everything else becomes justification. Investigators began to map the timeline differently, not by dates, but by decisions. The decision not to confront. The decision not to ask for clarity. The decision not to seek perspective. The decision to write instead of speak. The decision to edit instead of reflect. Each one small. Each one defensible on its own. Together, irreversible. That's the most unsettling part of this fictional story. There was no single moment where everything went wrong. There was a sequence of choices that made turning back less likely each time. By the time the notebook was left behind, the outcome wasn't inevitable. It was protected. Protected from doubt. Protected from contradiction. Protected from alternate interpretations. And that's why, in the end, the notebook failed to do what its author intended. Instead of proving inevitability, it documented decision-making. Instead of erasing agency, it highlighted it. Instead of securing legacy, it exposed intent. But there was one last detail investigators couldn't ignore, a pattern they hadn't noticed until the very end. Throughout the notebook, across months of entries, there was a recurring omission. He never wrote about one thing. Not once. Not even indirectly. And once that absence was noticed, it reframed everything yet again. Because the thing he never mentioned was the possibility of walking away. Not leaving the guest house. Not checking into the hotel. But truly walking away from the story he was building. The absence of that option wasn't oversight. It was rejection. And that rejection, quiet, deliberate, and absolute, was the clearest evidence of all. Because people who believe they have no choice will still imagine escape. People who refuse to imagine escape have already chosen. But why was that option never written down? Why was it excluded so completely? And what did that tell investigators about what he feared most? The answer to that lies in the final layer of the notebook. The part that wasn't written. The part that was lived. And the last decision he made before everything became irreversible. The last decision wasn't written anywhere. That's what made it invisible for so long. In this fictional dramatized account, investigators eventually realized that the notebook, dense as it was, ended before the most important choice was made. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because the final decision didn't belong on paper. It belonged in behavior. Up until that point, every step had been mediated through language. Thoughts written, sentences edited, pages torn out. Language was how he controlled the narrative, how he insulated himself from contradiction, how he converted emotion into logic. But the final step didn't require language. It required commitment. And commitment doesn't argue with itself. When people are still deciding, they write. They list. They compare. They justify. Writing is a way to slow time down, to keep options open. When people stop writing, it's often because the decision has already been made. That's what happened here. The notebook ended not with a conclusion, but with silence. And that silence coincided with a shift in his routine. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But once investigators overlaid the timing, the pattern emerged. He stopped revisiting old entries. Stopped refining language. Stopped correcting tone. He stopped needing the notebook. Because the narrative no longer required reinforcement. That's the paradox of certainty. Once it's locked in, it no longer needs maintenance. This is where many people expect a dramatic final moment, a breakdown, a last-minute hesitation, a sign of inner conflict returning. There was none. What replaced it was something far more unsettling. Normalcy. He moved through his days without visible distress. Conversations were polite. Interactions were functional. There were no emotional leaks. No signals that something irreversible had already been chosen. That normalcy fooled everyone. Because when people imagine danger, they look for disruption, instability, erratic behavior. They don't expect someone to become more composed. But composure can be a symptom, especially when it arrives suddenly, after prolonged internal conflict.